Good evening and welcome. Thank you for braving the weather to join us. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And on behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome you to the 2009 Berkley Center Lectures with Hans Joas on the topic, Universal Human Rights, A New Genealogy. We're delighted you can all be here and especially delighted to have you, Professor Joas, with us tonight and for most of this week. At this stage, I'd also like to acknowledge the co-sponsors of our series, Georgetown College, the Georgetown Library Associates, the BMW Center for German and European Studies, and the German Embassy. Human rights is one of those topics universally viewed as important. In the year 2009, whatever one's worldview, religious or secular, whatever one's particular tradition or political orientation, the idea that human beings have rights simply by virtue of participation in humanity is compelling and powerful. It's an idea that binds most of us together here in this room and beyond, but it's also an idea that divides us. What are these human rights? Where do they come from? Are they universal? And if so, how? And perhaps most important, how do they matter for our lives together, for our politics, for our engagement around the world? These are some big questions. I think you'll agree it's a good thing we've got 3 evenings instead of 1 to try to sort them out. Not answer them, but just sort them out. Take a whack at them. Before I introduce President DeGioia, who'll say some more about the lecture series and our guest, just a few words about the Berkley Center and our work. The center was created about 3.5 years ago now in the President's office as part of a university-wide effort building on our Catholic and Jesuit identity to advance intercultural and interreligious understanding. Our programs and events are designed to build and share knowledge about religion and ethics as they relate to global policy challenges of diplomacy, democracy, development, and dialogue. We invite you to learn more about our programs, to visit our website, to sign up for our mailing list, and more broadly, to join us in this conversation, this ongoing conversation, which is not about to end, about these very complex topics. This week's lectures are a vital part of that conversation, and it's now my pleasure to introduce President DeGioia, who will introduce Professor Joas. Dr. Don J. DeGioia, who's known to just about everyone here, has led Georgetown University since 2001. Prior to his appointment as president, he served for 22 years in various administrative positions at the university, including as senior vice president and dean of student affairs. A philosopher by discipline and background, he somehow found time as president to continue to teach courses ranging from topics such as the practice of leadership to human rights, a culture in crisis, which of course echoes our theme this week. Dr. DeGioia's presidency has seen Georgetown's emergence as a global force in higher education and an innovator in efforts to link up our core mission in teaching and research with service to the wider world. I'll just mention a couple of examples in this regard: the creation of a School of Foreign Service campus in Doha, Qatar, our broad engagement with China, and support for interreligious dialogue at a national and at an international level. Among his many roles, President DeGioia is a member of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and has served as chair of its Education Committee. He represents Georgetown at the World Economic Forum and on the Council on Foreign Relations. Closer to home, in 2008, he was honored by Washingtonian Magazine as a Washingtonian of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, President Jack DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Tom. And it's a pleasure to be with you tonight and to welcome all of you to this 3-part lecture series, which begins this evening. And we are privileged to have with us the distinguished social theorist, Dr. Hans Joas, who's professor of sociology and a member of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and the Max Weber Professor and Director of the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies at the University of Erfurt. A preeminent scholar of the American pragmatists, he has made lasting contributions to our understanding of pragmatism, democracy, religion, human values, and human rights. With the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by all the nations of the world in 1948, and since that time, the issue of human rights has had a profound impact on the relationships between states and individuals and communities. And in tonight's lecture, Dr. Joas will examine the emergence of human rights and the circumstances that have contributed to our current understanding of human dignity. And subsequent lectures on tomorrow and Thursday evening will consider the sacredness of the person and the ways that religious and philosophical traditions can impact universal values of human rights. Born in Germany after the Second World War, his experiences as a child and his Catholic faith have given him a deep interest in ideas of equality, social justice, and human rights. He entered the academy in 1968, studying at the University of Munich and then at the Free University of Berlin. And during that time, he was exposed to the studies of social psychology, sociology, and the American democratic system. And each of these traditions have played a significant role in his research since that time. As I mentioned a moment ago, particularly interested in the American pragmatists. And in that context, his research has covered a wide range of theorists, including Emile Durkheim, George Herbert Mead, Peter Berger, Jürgen Habermas, and Charles Taylor. Taylor, you might remember, spoke last year in this lecture series. Through his work, Dr. Joas has become well known for his theories about American pragmatism in relation to creativity, including his well-known book, The Creativity of Action, which was published in 1996. A wide range of other publications, including The Genesis of Values, War and Modernity, Do We Need Religion on the Experience of Self-Transcendence, and Social Theory, which just came out this past year. He's the former president of the ISA Research Committee on Theory and has previously held visiting professorships at a number of universities, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the New School for Social Research, Duke University, and the University of Vienna. And he also serves on the editorial board of a number of leading international sociological journals, including the American Journal of Sociology. We live at a time when nations are increasingly interdependent, people more interconnected, humanity less divided by narrow domestic walls. With the emergence of globalization, we need to examine anew our responsibility to ensure that human rights are guaranteed and protected for all people. How we define this responsibility is our work. And with the increased engagement between various religions, philosophies, and cultures, and as Dr. Joas will discuss during his lecture series here at Georgetown, it is urgent that we address what a universal system of rights requires and the kind of dialogue and consensus building that must take place to develop it. This emphasis on interreligious and intercultural dialogue is central to the work that we do here at Georgetown, at the Berkley Center, and in a number of other places across the university, and it is central to advancing the cause of human rights internationally. So tonight we are honored to have Dr. Hans Joas with us, and I look forward to these lectures and to the discussions that they will generate in our campus community. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Hans Joas.
Good evening. Thank you so much, President De Joya and Professor Banshaw, for inviting me. I consider it a great honor to be here and to give this series of lectures on the history of human rights from a very specific perspective. It is probably helpful if I start this lecture series with a somewhat longer introduction in which I try to characterize the specific perspective from which my research on human rights is being undertaken. For a long time, As has just been mentioned, I have had a very strong interest in the study of all sorts of creative processes. The creative process that interests me most in the present phase is the creation of new values, new value commitments. I prefer not to speak of the creation, however, but of the genesis of values and value commitments, because it is one of the seemingly paradoxical features of our commitment to values that we do not experience them as being created by us. There is a passive dimension in our value commitments. We experience values as captivating us, attracting or grasping us. In German, there is a somewhat old-fashioned word for that, ergriffen sein, which I think brings this out very clearly, the passive dimension. Something grasps me. There is a passive dimension in all creative processes that has always been described in terms like inspiration, for example. But in the case of values, it is clearly only from an observer's standpoint that we can see them as created. The participants in these processes do not feel committed to an entity of their own making, but consider values as something they have discovered or rediscovered. From this perspective, a study of major innovations in the field of values, and however we date this process, I think widespread belief in human rights is something like such an innovation. Such a study is neither a philosophical attempt to offer a completely rational justification for these values, nor is it a merely historical reconstruction of the contingencies of their emergence. Philosophical justifications do not need history. In the case of human rights, they mostly develop their argument out of an alleged character of reason or moral obligation as such, or out of the conditions of a thought experiment, or the fundamentals of an idealized rational discourse. The history of ideas is then mostly seen as the prehistory of the definitive solution that can be found in a specific philosophy, and you will have recognized which philosophers I had in mind when I wrote this sentence, let's say, in the philosophies of Kant or John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas. Historiography, on the other hand, certainly has some implicit elements of an evaluative character and of their justification, and it can, of course, be a historiography of philosophical, political, religious arguments concerning human rights and universal human dignity. But as historiography, it seems to be nothing but an empirical reconstruction of historical processes and not a contribution to the justification of values. In this division of labor, the disciplines of history and philosophy thus support a strict distinction between questions of genesis and questions of validity. The social sciences, at least in my eyes, and particularly a sociology inspired, one could say, by American pragmatism on the one hand and German 19th century historicism on the other hand, such a social science could help to overcome this separation of philosophy and history. Let me first say in negative terms why I think such an overcoming is necessary. I do not believe in the possibility of a purely rational justification of ultimate values. If something is to be called an ultimate value, what should its rational justification be based upon? What could be more basic and still have an evaluative character? Now, many of those who are like me skeptical with regard to such ultimate rational justifications fear that such a non-foundationalist, pragmatist attitude will lead into relativism, historical relativism, cultural relativism, or open the door for postmodern arbitrariness. In the case of human rights, they rightly claim we cannot afford a merely playful attitude. But the alternative of either ultimate rational justification or relativism, again, merely reproduces the sharp distinction of genesis and validity. If this distinction does not really hold, at least with regard to values, if we have, as Hilary Putnam says, to get beyond the fact-value dichotomy, I can say in positive terms what such an approach could contribute. Such an approach can connect narration and justification in a specific way when it analyzes the history of the emergence and the dissemination of certain values, in our case, the history of human rights. As a narrative reconstruction of such a process, it makes us aware that our commitments to values are based on experiences and the interpretation of these experiences. They thus become recognizable as contingent. This means non-necessary. Not longer do they appear in this analysis as simply pre-given. But such a narration of a contingent process of values as historical individualities, as the German 19th century historicists would have said, does not weaken our commitment to them or destroy it. The result of such a study can be what I call, with an expression that may sound strange to you at first, an affirmative genealogy of a value or value complex. You all recognize the notion of genealogy, of course, taken from Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the pioneer of all studies about the genesis of values. That's why I devoted the first chapter of my Genesis of Values book to him. He emphasized more than anybody before him the contingency of the genesis of values, the role of power in this genesis, and he assumed that we are always losing faith in these idols as soon as we see how they have been fabricated. That's Nietzsche's expression. I agree with Nietzsche's emphasis on contingency and the role of power, but not with his idea that the genealogical method necessarily has a destructive character. The famous late British philosopher Bernard Williams, in his last book, has spoken of a vindicatory genealogy. I take from Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutics the term affirmative in order to emphasize that the insight into the contingency of the genesis of certain values can even strengthen our commitment to them. A brief example, because this is rather abstract reasoning, will, I think, suffice. Why should the fact that post-war Germans feel committed to human rights, or particularly committed to human rights because of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes, lead to a weakening of our value commitment as soon as we become aware of this contingent context? Why should the fact that power, in this case the military power of the Allied forces, played a crucial role in the democratization of Germany, why should this insight into the role of power weaken a German's commitment to democracy? Nietzsche and his followers, including Michel Foucault, are plainly wrong in this regard. Now, I think the social sciences can contribute to such an affirmative genealogy of values in a double sense. We can study the dynamics that lead to value innovations and the institutionalization of such new values. This one could call the genesis of values, in a rather trivial, in a chronological sense. But we also have to study such a genesis in a different sense, in a sense I call existential. We do not feel committed to values for the simple reason that they have once come into the world. Human rights, for example, seen as a product of the 18th century, could have disappeared again after their emergence. We would consider them a mere curiosity of the age of enlightenment then, like mesmerism. Now, this is, of course, what motivates many to distinguish between genesis and validity. But this distinction does not completely disconnect validity from Genesis. Moreover, we always have to ask whether the cultural forces that once made the institutionalization of a value possible are still vital today, whether new cultural forces have come up that are able to compensate for the loss of weakened traditions, and what is more, whether there are new experiences that reinvigorate old values and revitalize old traditions. Without experiences, values are, according to Paul Valéry, nothing but stuffed animals on a shelf. Now, I give you a brief overview of this first lecture. The main topic of this first lecture is the interplay between the history of violence, mostly state-organized violence in the 20th century, and the history of human rights. So, the problem of today's talk, not of the whole series, not of the whole book, is what is the role of experiences of violence in the history of human rights? How can experiences of violence be transformed into value commitments, and more specifically, into a commitment to the values of moral universalism? My first step will be a very brief examination of important documents from the history of human rights, asking whether we can detect in them traces of the history of violence. So 4 steps. This is the first one. Second step, I will turn around and ask the question as to which parts of the history of violence have indeed entered the discourse on human rights so far. If the result of this second step is partly negative, that is, if it can be shown that the current human rights discourse is highly selective, then it becomes obvious that we need conceptual means for the analysis of what has not become part of the official discourse, for insufficiently articulated experiences. The research on trauma, and this is my third step, has recently become prominent in the humanities and the social sciences as a means for exactly that purpose. I share the belief that we have an important approach here, although I am deeply skeptical with regard to some work that has been done on that basis. Fourthly and lastly, I will try to systematize the conditions for the successful transformation of experiences of violence into universalist value commitments. This will also lead me to a concluding reflection on why such historico-sociological research is indeed relevant for moral philosophy. First, if you take important codifications of human rights as your point of departure, it's not difficult to demonstrate, at least for this time after the Second World War, the importance of the history of violence for them. Now, in the German version of this manuscript, I go through the early German post-war constitutions on the level of the German Länder, the individual states. In the German case, then also on the level of the federal constitution, the concept of human dignity was placed at the beginning of the constitution and formed a crucial point of orientation already in the plans of the most important group of the anti-Hitler resistance, the so-called Kreisau Circle, before 1945, and then permeated the preparations for new constitutions in these individual states. They mostly refer to barbarism and annihilation and derive from the experience of barbarism the justification for the basic value orientation of the constitutions. But the same, and that is of more interest for you, is true on the global level. Several authors in the last 10 years have meticulously studied how a shared repudiation of Nazism and fascism influenced the drafts preceding the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. A Dutch historian, Johannes Morsink, has called the experience of Nazism and of the war the epistemic foundation of this declaration. And that's an expression I like because it's kind of paradoxical. I mean, what he calls the epistemic foundation is, of course, a foundation, but not in the usual conventional sense of epistemology in philosophy. It means the common ground of various religious and non-religious worldviews. Let me illustrate with a few details how the horror of the Nazi crimes is implicitly present in some of the articles of the declaration. The emphasis on the unity of mankind in Article 1 is consciously directed against the destruction of universalism by means of race theories. Similarly, the right to life in Article 3 comes from the revulsion against the Nazi euthanasia of handicapped people. Article 4 mentions not only slavery, but also servitude, and the reason for that was that the forced labor of members from the population of defeated states during the Second World War. Article 5 does not only prohibit torture, but also, I quote, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in general, again, partly because of the medical experiments of Nazi doctors. Article 14, everybody has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, derives from the mass expatriations of the Third Reich, although its exact wording was attenuated because the original formulation, the right to seek and be granted asylum, was not accepted by Arab states. They considered the obligation to grant asylum to 500,000 of Palestinian refugees after the foundation of the State of Israel a support for Israeli policy. What a tragic connection with Nazism. Article 21, declaring a right to political participation, was consciously directed against the fascist doctrine of the incarnation of a substantive political will in an uncontrolled political leader. Again, the article was attenuated because Great Britain did not accept a reference to secret ballot with regard to its colonies. And Article 30 offered the seeds for an internationalist interpretation of human rights in the sense of a collective responsibility of all states to ensure a political order everywhere that would be in conformity with human rights. A late response to the fact that prior to the war, the struggle against Nazism had certainly not been considered such a pressing task for the international community. Okay, so I think the point is clear. This was a very abbreviated version of this first point. Second point. The picture, therefore, seems to be clear. I should add immediately, however, that my emphasis on the role of the experiences of Nazism, war, and a little bit later the Holocaust, does not mean that I defend what has been called one of the myths of human rights historiography, namely the assertion that the fact that we have the Universal Declaration can completely be explained out of this response to Nazism. This would underestimate the fact that the plans to promote an international Bill of Rights were well developed long before the scale of the Nazi horror was fully known. It would underestimate the role of other human rights violations and the reasons why there was a window of opportunity for such a declaration in the first place. I will have more to say on these other conditions for the emergence of the Human Rights Declaration of 1948 in my third lecture. Here I would draw your attention to something different. A problem arises if we turn around and ask which parts of the history of violence have indeed been taken up in the Declaration of Human Rights. Although it is true that positive values can be distilled from negative experiences, it would be absurd to assume that injustice always leads to higher forms of justice. Violence somehow necessarily leads to progress. I quote Max Weber, according to the inescapable pragmatism of all action, Max Weber wrote, force and the threat of force unavoidably breed more force. So it's the opposite of the assumption that the experience of violence might lead to more intense commitments to universalist values. Suffering alone does not produce values. There has to be a transformative power in order to prevent suffering from leading to desperation and hopelessness or to a cyclical escalation of violence. In many cases, such a transformation has not taken place. The Holocaust is not the only case of mass murder and genocide in the 20th century. What is more, historians like Mark Masauer have convincingly demonstrated that we should not take Nazism and the role of state-organized violence in it as paradigmatic for all cases of collective violence in the 20th century. For obvious reasons, for example, the Stalinist crimes were more or less ignored, when the UN declaration was drafted. I mean, the Soviet Union would never have accepted an extensive discussion of the Gulag and the Stalinist crimes. The theory of totalitarianism drew a simple parallel between Stalinism and Nazism, but I think it's not really helpful when we ask to what extent we can really explain Stalinist violence. Ethnic categories, for example, became more and more important in Soviet politics. We have to include the mass starvation of Ukrainian Cossacks, the mass deportation of whole peoples deemed unreliable prior to the war, or of the Chechens and others during the war, or of the population of defeated nations like the Germans, or the elites of Baltic peoples after the war in our image of Stalinism. And we have to ask what the consequences would have been if these crimes had played a role in the drafting of the declaration. And if we overcome the Eurocentric perspective and include the history of colonialism, we realize that very frequently it was not the state, as in the cases of Nazism and Stalinism, that can be made responsible for the relocation and extinction of tribes and peoples. In countries like Australia, but also in parts of Africa, North and South America, and Russia, local initiatives of settlers to secure land, water, and other resources played a decisive role. And this is not a problem of the past only, as we can see in Brazil or Israel and Palestine today. Hannah Arendt was among the first to point out that there are indeed connections between colonialism and the Nazi strategies in Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Others claim continuities between Tsarist colonialism in the Caucasus or Central Asia and Stalinism. We have to bear in mind these connections and the violence during colonialist rule, in the anti-colonialist struggles, and in the civil wars and violent regimes that often follow upon colonialism. I'm mentioning all this here because I share with Mark Masauer or Michael Mann a skepticism concerning an exclusively state-centered view of mass violence, but also because I'm convinced that this history has not yet fully become a part of the human rights discourse. I'm not really clear myself what the juridical consequences of such a more comprehensive discourse with regard to human rights would be, but I deny that anybody can predict that result without first allowing such a discourse to happen. Third, this leads us to the question as to what the consequences of the history of violence are if they have remained outside such discourse. Moreover, one can ask whether this idea of a transformation of suffering into value commitment is appropriate at all. It should, of course, in a certain sense I repeat myself here, not be misunderstood as a kind of historical consolation, the production of retrospective meaning. This would mean that we fall back into a teleological philosophy of history. For the two questions, namely what the long-term consequences of the experience of violence are, and how we have to imagine the tension between such experience and all possible articulation of it, we need a new approach. One concept has been developed in the last decades and has almost become fashionable in the humanities that claims to reach that goal. I am referring to the concept of trauma. And I would like to reflect a little bit on this concept and on the ways it could be useful or not for answering these questions. What is a trauma? Since this concept stems from medicine and psychiatry, it is appropriate to consult handbooks from these disciplines to find an official definition of it. The official definition, now I quote not of trauma, but of post-traumatic stress disorder by the American Psychiatric Association is the following, I quote, the development of characteristic symptoms following exposure to an extreme traumatic stressor involving direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury, or other threat to one's physical integrity, or witnessing an event that involves death, injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of another person, or learning about unexpected or violent death, serious harm or threat of death or injury experienced by a family member or other close associate. Okay, that's a rather technical, rather precise definition. This concept of trauma was in the beginning, as you may know, and there are books now on the history of the concept of trauma, and the name of a purely physical harm. It was Sigmund Freud and others who extended it to psychological processes. Freud, however, vacillated between a kind of literal parallel here and an interpretation of psychological injury as a possible result from merely imaginary processes. Freud's own attention was directed back to the importance of real and not imaginary experiences of violence in the course of the First World War. That is, by one of the crucial events of the history of violence in the 20th century. The debates about shell shock were a first case in point. The Vietnam War and the debates about long-term consequences of the Holocaust for its survivors and even for their offspring led to the intensification of the discussion about the consequences of violence, both for the victims but also for the perpetrators. Now, I would like to use a literary example for this talk in order to demonstrate what the importance of this concept of trauma for the dynamics of the genesis of values could look like. The most impressive literary text in this regard, in my eyes, is the last novel by the great German 20th century writer Alfred Döblin. I don't know whether you have ever come across this name, Alfred Döblin. He's very famous for perhaps the most important book on Berlin. It's called Berlin Alexanderplatz. But he has many other books. So I'm talking about a book that is called Hamlet, or The Long Night Comes to an End. Written shortly before and after, so give me 5 minutes to speak about that. And I think you will see why it is so important for my purposes. Written shortly before and after the end of the Second World War, this book focuses on a homecoming soldier, not on a German, but a British soldier of the Second World War, seriously wounded in the attack of Japanese kamikaze planes on his transport ship. He loses a leg and sinks into, as this title says, the long night of utter alienation from his previous world. Since the attempts to restore his health with psychotherapeutic means remain fruitless, his mother decides to take him into her own care and thus to relax his rigor mortis. But it soon becomes clear that the son, whose name is Edward Allison in the book, is not only in need of medical attendance or maternal love, but is driven by a passion of questioning as soon as he is ready to take part in conversation at all. He must find out who is to blame for this mutilation and for all the other victims who perhaps are no longer able to pose such questions. He must know who and what is responsible for this war and the whole historic disaster in Europe since 1914. An answer to this question his mother cannot give, nor can he find the answer with his father, who as a great and successful writer should be predisposed to answer such questions, but who has always used his art, not as a means to illuminate questions of guilt and meaning, but as a means to escape them. For him, I quote, wars in the light of world history just happen among men from time to time, like influenza, typhoid, or scarlet fever, against which one hasn't found a remedy either. But his father has an ingenious idea that gets the son's healing process fully started. He is well aware that rational discussions are not the appropriate medium if questions of meaning are concerned, but stories. And this is why he proposes to tell stories and to leave it to everybody to draw his or her own conclusions from them. Therefore, evening parties are organized during which members and friends of the Allison family tell all sorts of stories, old ones and new ones, familiar and unfamiliar ones, and the son takes part. In the beginning, he remains quiet and taciturn, extremely reserved, like most of the time since his traumatic experience, gloomy, dangerous for his relatives, a bomb delayed. But certain passages in the stories begin to attract his interest, and he slowly shows reactions and becomes a participant. The author masterfully designs these stories so that they contain points of contact for Edward's experiences and his probing quest for meaning. But again, there is no linear path to full recovery, because the evening parties offer to the storytellers ample opportunity to reinterpret and redefine their own relationships to other participants in the medium of these stories. This is particularly true for the parents. The more Edward finds back into normal life, the more fragile the marriage of his parents becomes. The way to the truth, which Edward, the son, has to go for the sake of healing, is a dangerous enterprise for a couple whose relationship had been transformed into covert hostility and mutual dissimulation a long time before. It was the cold and unloving atmosphere of the family from which the son once fled into the war. The novel is called Hamlet because, as in Shakespeare's play, a son uncovers old guilt in a family's history and in the state of Denmark, and thus can bring the long night of falsehood with its specters to an end. But at this end, we don't encounter healing, but a new collapse. At first of the family, then of the father, who, tried to the limit by insinuations of his wife, attacks her violently, flees from the house, followed by his wife. I will not give you the whole story. And then the collapse of the son, who now recognizes that his insistence on truth had to have destructive consequences in a world that tried to protect its feeling of meaningfulness by the refusal to accept any responsibility for the history of violence. Okay, I will not describe the further way of the parents and so on. Edward is finally set free for a new life. Now, perhaps because it's funny, I mentioned that the author vacillated between two conclusions to this novel. And the book came out in West Germany and in East Germany with the two different conclusions. In the West German, perhaps in the East German version, he ends up becoming a social reformer. And in the West German version of the 1950s, he enters into a monastery. Now, this novel contains in enormous vividness all the dimensions a theory of trauma has to contain, I think. The shock of the experience of violence itself, which penetrates into what I call the sacred sphere of my corporeality. Traumatization by the shattering of fundamental certainties in one's relationship to the world. The impossibility to get beyond traumatization except through narration. The connection between narration and the constitution of new meaning and new values. The unsettling consequences of such new values and new meaning for existing social contexts. The inevitability of expanding political questions of meaning into the existential and religious dimension. There can be no doubt, therefore, that this concept of trauma can have a great potential for the questions I am discussing here in connection with the human rights question. But it becomes equally clear when one reads the relevant publications that an inflationary use of this concept can be extremely problematical, because it blurs the specificities of the experience of violence when, for example, under the influence of post-structuralism, these are identified with allegedly traumatizing components of all human communication. So if we always misunderstand ourselves, if communication as such is traumatizing, I think we lose the specificity of the really dramatic experiences of violence. More influential, particularly in the US, is the concept of a cultural trauma, as it has been developed by a school of sociologists at Yale University around Jeffrey Alexander. They do not only extend the notion of trauma to whole cultures, but they subjectivate it. They write, for example, cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event. Now, the historical context out of which this impulse to offer such an extremely culturalist version arises can easily be grasped. The Holocaust is, the more the temporal distance grows, more and more, and not less and less, considered the gigantic trauma of Jews as victims, but also of Germans and others as perpetrators, and of mankind in general. The enslavement of the Africans deported to North America is, the more the temporal distance grows, more and more, and not less and less, defined as a trauma of the American blacks and of US society as a whole. It seems that this delay can elegantly be explained by a theory of trauma. But we can see, I think, that it is not unproblematical to see it like that. Let me mention an especially critical point here, namely the criticism of the work of the American historian Peter Novick. According to the proponents of the cultural trauma theory, Novick states that the Holocaust became central to contemporary history because it became central to America, that it became central to America because it became central to America's Jewish community, and that it became central to Jews because it became central to the ambitions of Jewish organizations who were central to the mass media in all its forms. Now, I would agree with Novick in a certain sense, and would insist on the necessity to make a clear distinction between psychological and social consequences of traumas on the one hand, and the social construction of cultural memory and the cultural phenomenon called trauma on the other hand. Cultural traumas are neither the presupposition for individual traumatization nor their consequence. Individual traumatization as such does not depend on the cultural definition of something as trauma, although this cannot be the last word on these dynamics of experience and articulation. The culturalism of the cultural trauma concept has to be checked by something I call experientialism. Now, fourth and last step before the conclusion, but this is a little bit longer. Such an experientialism does not assume an access to experiences that is not itself symbolically mediated. It cannot be blamed for falling back into the time prior to the linguistic turn. But it marks the fact that in the case of cultural innovation processes, impulses are at work that can change established patterns of interpretation. Some of them are attempts to articulate experiences which, from the perspective of the actor, have not been sufficiently expressed in these patterns. It can, however, also be the discovery that an existing interpretive system contains more possibilities than have been realized so far, that it can be mobilized to take certain perceptions more seriously and to allow their explosive force to burst the dominant patterns of interpretation. If we analyze, as I propose, processes of innovation in a triangle of values, practices, and institutions, the dynamics of innovation can have its departure in all three corners. Again, this sounds too abstract, and that is why I would like to illustrate it with reference to a concrete case, namely the important human rights movement of the 19th century, the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery. Perhaps I skip a little bit here, but I tell you what I'm skipping, namely, let's say, the two conventional explanations of the emergence of the abolitionist movement. One, a Marxist materialist explanation that somehow production based on slavery lost its productivity, or that capitalists lost interest in it, and so on. I think this was a very influential interpretation in the 1970s, for example, but there is a kind of scholarly consensus today that it is not correct. And now in a very simplistic way, you could say you have also a kind of opposite explanation that one might call idealistic or something like that, that as soon as you have documents like the 18th century documents, all men are created equal, this will somehow, over time, develop a force of its own so that people will compare what Thomas Jefferson probably had not done, the fact that he wrote all men are created equal, but was a slave owner, that after some decades or so people brought these two things together, saw that they contradict each other, and so they changed the world. I think both explanations don't work, but we need another explanation if the two don't work. And I will try to offer such an alternative explanation. I will mention three components of I hope, successful explanation. First, we have to take the religious character of the abolitionist movement seriously. There's a clear continuity between the arguments of the 19th century abolitionists and older objections against slavery in radical Protestantism. But this is not what I try to emphasize when I say religious. The movement itself was a kind of religious reawakening, like even the civil rights movement more than 100 years later. This statement, again, can easily be trivialized by saying that America's political culture in general was and is so deeply religious, and that there were, of course, religious justifications of the system of slavery as well. But my emphasis is not so much on religious worldviews, but on the dynamics of such movements of reawakening. Movements in which prophetic speakers interpret sinful conditions as opportunities for a change of one's ways to guide one's life, and through which collective moral orientation does indeed take place. The evangelical schemas of public confession and sin played an enormous role in the emergence of the anti-slavery movement. Contrary to a widespread view in the sociology of social movements, cultural goals have not only recently, under conditions of post-industrialism, become crucial for social movements. One can only come to this view if one ignores the role of religion in the history of social movements. And this religious dimension has an institutional or organizational side as well. I quote an American sociologist, Michael Young, who wrote an interesting book on that. In America, if not elsewhere, religious institutions appear to have mediated the earliest inter-regional and sustained protests, not the state. To say religious is, of course, too general because it leads one to ignore the specificities of the particular religious faith involved here. I'm talking of those versions of the Christian religion in which Christianity is conceived as a radical call for moral decentering, for an effort to see the world from the perspective of others, and not only of those to whom we are connected by affectual ties, because this can always be a mere extension of our self-centeredness, but from the perspective of our poorest brothers, the least of these my brethren, if you recognize the gospel. It is an empirical question, then, whether there are also secular movements, worldviews, and value orientations with this same effect, namely a heightened sensitivity to the suffering of others. I call this first component of such an explanation an emotional intensification of an already given universalist moral orientation. The second element is the transnational or international character of the movement. The abolitionists formed an international network and tried to exert pressure on national governments through international regulations. One cannot speak of an international regime here, as people like John Mayer do, imposed on the different nations, because the international regime itself is partly due to national abolitionist movements. It is also not true, as the Stanford historian Lynn Hunt claims, that after the American and French revolutions, the discussions and decrees now transpired almost exclusively within specific national frameworks. Today, on the contrary, we can recognize the anti-slavery movement as the most important historical precursor of what is called transnational advocacy networks in contemporary political science. Individuals and small groups in various countries opened up alternative channels of communication, collected and reported facts, invented or copied repertoires for the expression of protest and the strategic implementation of goals. The conditions of success depended, of course, on national conditions. But without international cooperation, it is doubtful that one of the national branches of this movement would ever have been successful. Although emancipation of the slaves in the US became possible only when the North defeated the South in the Civil War, British public opinion, mobilized by abolitionist activists, became a crucial factor in preventing British recognition of the South. So I call this second component a practical transnational organization of moral universalism. Even more important for my present argument is the third component. A little bit difficult. The cognitive repercussions of the ongoing process of marketization. Even if there is, as I said so far, a strong moral motivation for decentering and an international opportunity structure for the successful formation of networks, the self-understanding of our moral responsibility depends on certain cognitive presuppositions, like assumptions about causal connections between what we are doing and what happens elsewhere, and of our possibilities for action. If we follow the American historian Thomas Haskell's stimulating contributions on the abolitionist movement, we have to see a connection, but a connection that is very different from the Marxist idea here, between the rise of industrial capitalism and the emergence of humanitarian sensibility in the same period. Namely, a change based in a change in cognitive presuppositions. The same process that led economic actors to pursue their utility-oriented actions on a more and more global scale constructed a bridge for the morally decentered actors, by the way, often the wives and children of important business people, to go beyond mere moral outrage about abuses in other parts of the world and establish connections between their own actions and these abuses. They begin to see themselves as being responsible for an overcoming of these abuses. Think of the boycott of Caribbean sugar, for example, in Britain in the early 19th century, and they derive moral obligations from this. I call this third component a cognitive attribution of moral responsibility, or a change of the cognitive attribution of moral responsibility induced by social structural changes. In such an empirically grounded collective moral reorientation, finally, a new cultural space opens up in which experiences of repression, injustice, and violence can be expressed. This is the cultural space, then, for the articulation of traumatic experiences. Lamentation thus turns into accusation. Helplessness changes into firmness and resolution. Very briefly at the end, at the beginning, I described my combination of narration and analytic argumentation as an affirmative genealogy of moral universalism. I see it as the alternative to the idea that can be found in Kant or Habermas, that universalistic moral orientations have to rely on purely rational motivation. I'm asking what stronger forces for such a moral universalism we have, what their roots in cultural traditions and strong experiences could be, and how they can be transformed into individual and collective action. I could only offer some fragments from this attempt here in the first lecture. But I would not like to conclude without the following remark. human rights are, of course, only one possible articulation of all the suffering in the history of violence. They have to retain this character of being such an attempt at the articulation of suffering. We can therefore derive from them the claim to make the relevant discourse more comprehensive, to take into account still unarticulated suffering, and to counter cultural complacency in general. What cannot be derived from them is a cultural triumphalism, in the sense of a feeling of cultural superiority, because we are allegedly the ones who invented human rights. This would be as self-contradictory as the use of the most important symbol of suffering, pain, and victimhood in the Christian culture, namely the crucifix, as a sign of war and victory in crusades has always been. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have about 20-25 minutes for conversation. We have a mic here in the center aisle. I'd ask you to line up if you have a question and introduce yourself briefly, and we can continue the conversation.
I guess I'll break the ice here. My name is Sorab Ghasemi. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. I have two short questions for you, which probably don't have short answers. One is, when you were talking about the role of trauma as it relates to the genealogy of human rights, I was wondering if you could also comment on how the concept of memory ties in with that. And my second question is, I'm just curious, you referred to Foucault's conception of power relations as being wrong, and I was wondering if you could explain for us in what way it is so. Thank you.
Yes. I mean, with regard to the second question, I feel tempted to say, could you wait for the second lecture? Because the second lecture is about different explanations for the abolition of torture and for the reforms of the penal justice system in France and in Europe in general in the 18th century. So a topic where I have one-third of tomorrow's talk is about Foucault and why he's wrong. So, I mean, but I can't force you to come back tomorrow, so if you don't, I'll send you maybe what I have to say on that, but I postpone this, okay? And memory, of course. Okay, good, thank you. And memory, of course, I would say, I mean, comes in the same, maybe ambiguous way as this trauma concept came in here. I made a distinction here between traumatization that is, let's say, really based on first-hand experience. You know, I see a difference, let's say, between people who were slaves and people who say they are slaves are their ancestors, so to speak. These are different claims. And I think the same ambiguity that you have here, whether we are talking about long-term consequences of real experiences of violence that are not restricted to the people, of course, who had these experiences. There is clear empirical evidence for the fact, let's say, that the children of people who had been traumatized in this way are somehow influenced by the traumatization of their parents. But this does not mean that these children have the same traumatizing experiences. So I would apply the same to this notion of memory. Do we speak about a kind of culturally institutionalized memory, or do we speak about my personal reconstruction of my past, my experiences here? I think both things, you know, this is not, it doesn't make sense to play one thing out against the other, but it makes enormous sense to distinguish the two and to insist on the distinction. So, yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Nathan Pippinger. I'm a senior in Georgetown College, and I wanted to ask you a question about the point you made at the very end of your lecture, which I thought was important, which is that because the cultures that tend to be the writers and enforcers of the UDHR are those that have learned about human rights through sort of their own crimes, it would be ironic and kind of offensive to engage in triumphalism for sort of being enlightened on human rights. I was wondering if you could address a little bit how that concept plays out in an international arena that's defined by power relationships, simply because whenever a human rights conflict comes up, it does tend to be the winners and the stronger states in the system sort of writing the rules for everyone else, and there's a charge that human rights represent a sort of cultural imperialism against weaker states.
Okay, I really do not think that the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights is a case of cultural imperialism. Again, I mean, it's a little bit awkward if I say this is partly the topic of the third lecture. You are thinking ahead, so to speak, but there is some logical connection between these things, of course. So let me just say, I do not think, and that if we study the process of the drafting of the UN Declaration of 1948, and we see who participated on it, what were the religious, philosophical backgrounds, and so on of the contributing authors of this declaration, we see it, I would say, as an exemplary case of communication between competing secular and religious value orientations. It's not based in, let's say, an American understanding of rights, and then this had become imposed on the world. But that's only an aspect of your question. I mean, the larger aspect in the beginning of your question was, what do we do with the fact that the human rights are often misused for the legitimation of power political strategies? Now, I say, of course, nothing is immune against such misuse. I mean, you cannot have a value that is by itself immunized against a kind of strategic misuse. You can only address the specific cases in which you see this misuse happening. In that sense, the post-war history, I would rather say, is a positive history, in that sense that when this declaration was drafted, it could have remained mere paper, but it didn't. And now in many connections, even the nations like France and the US, you might most strongly claim a kind of superiority with regard to human rights, encounter, of course, others within these states, but also all over the world, who draw their attention to contradictions between what they are doing or proposing and what they claimed to be doing when they agreed with this declaration.
My name is Enrique Pumar, and I am a professor of sociology at Catholic University. I have a question for you.
Here in Washington?
Yes, here in Washington, northeast of the town. I have a question for you. I think that you said in the beginning that values, the formation and dissemination of values didn't need history, if I remember correctly. No. You didn't say that?
No, I said that about the self-understanding of many philosophers, okay, that they claim to offer a rational justification for something where they don't need history within their argument. My personal opinion is exactly the opposite. Okay. That's why I'm doing this historical work.
All right, well, I was going to ask you, how come we have trauma without history? But
yeah, no, but that's a misunderstanding, yes.
My name's Pierce Corden. I spent most of my career working in the United States government on arms control and disarmament issues. But I have two questions. The first is a follow-on to your dialogue just now about the rationality of rights. I assume you don't mean to say that rights are irrational, but that they are more than rational, that you bring into the understanding of them factors that are if you will, evolutionary, since there does seem to be, at least historically, an evolution in rights. I might observe that strikes me in this particular year as perhaps a bit Darwinian. The second question has to do with this matter of the victors and then the consequences of that in an area that's, from my perspective, a matter of human rights, but is usually articulated in terms of the laws of war, and that's the what's known euphemistically as collateral damage or the inviolability of civilians when a war is taking place. How do you sort of approach that, given, or how do you relate that to the reliance of Western and Eastern states on the strategy of deterrence, which almost by definition implies that if nuclear weapons are ever used, as they were, the amount of collateral damage is going to be more than collateral.
May I answer the first question in the following way, namely by introducing two conceptual distinctions. The first is between irrational and non-rational. So when we say irrational, it sounds as if the standard has to be rationality, but this standard has not been achieved. When we say non-rational, we say this is of a different kind, so to speak. And what I meant when I said that in the talk, in the introduction, is, for example, that, let's say, a strong belief in the dignity of all human beings, including, let's say, newborn infants, mentally handicapped, senile people, whatever. That this strong emotional attachment to the dignity of all human beings is not something that you develop in a process of rational argumentation. That's my point. Yeah, you may disagree, so to speak, but that's the point. That is not calling this irrational, of course, because for me this would be the highest value for which I try to find all sorts of justifications. But I'm aware when I develop these justifications that I have not really come to this commitment to this value through a process of rational justification, and I do not really expect others, so to speak, to convert to that exclusively by means of rational argumentation. So I do not say rational argumentation doesn't play a role here, but it would be, first, it would be empirically wrong to assume that people change their most fundamental value commitments through processes of rational argumentation, okay? So in that sense, all our value commitments are non-rational, which is different from irrational. And the second distinction I use in my writings is between evolutionary and evolutionist. So evolutionist is you have a kind of confidence that things get better and better. Evolutionary means you assume that there can be higher stages of development, but there is no guarantee at all for the achievement of these higher stages. So for me, the history of human rights is evolutionary, but not evolutionist, so to speak. I'm very much against the assumption, since we have a certain state of the development of rights now, we can more or less be sure that this will remain with us. I would say after the experiences of the 20th century, we cannot be sure. That's one of the major lessons of the 20th century, that nothing is stabilized by itself, but that it has to be stabilized, so to speak, by all sorts of efforts, including intellectual efforts, but many other things as well. Okay, that is my attempt to answer your first question. And this is, of course, connected with, if I may say so, with my much more general interest. I mean, it's not only an interest in the history of human rights, but in this dynamics of the development of our most fundamental value commitments. I have difficulties with the second question a little bit. Maybe I haven't understood it completely. I mean, I say what I understood, namely that you emphasize that in most military strategies, so-called, I mean, euphemistically called, collateral damage is simply part of the calculation. And that, now in my words, one could say in an age of enormous sensitization to the suffering of all human beings, this cannot simply be the case, so to speak, that we say, okay, we don't care that there are so many innocent victims. It just belongs to our strategy we cannot avoid it, so why talk about this? But the consequence of that would be that, let's say, people with strong universalist value commitments will maybe not become radical pacifists, but will become more outspoken with regard to the details of military strategic debate. But I don't know whether this is a satisfying response.